When we talk about children literature, we immediately think of something like Harry Potter, Cinderella, Winnie the Pooh. Those are the books that everyone knows because they read them in their childhood. In this episode, we will find out how people started to read fantasy and how fantasy became the staple of the genre. And let's start our journey by asking ourselves a question. Take a look at all of these books. Do you see anything that all of those books have in common? Well, that's right. All of those books are, in fact, fantasy novels. I personally never questioned the fact that all of the books, besides maybe some classic novels like Secret Garden, Little Women, Pippi Longstocking, are in fact fantasy novels. Children's literature is a whole different genre, but somehow fantasy is just dominating the scene. Of course, children's literature comes in a bunch of different genres, colors, shapes, and sizes. It can be a dystopian, young adult stories like Hunger Games. It can be historical fiction like Number the Stars. It can be realistic fiction like Wonder, fairy tales and folk tales like Cinderella, Snow White. Those can be graphic novels like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, or science fiction like A Wrinkle in Time. Today we are so used to describe fantasy literature as children's literature because we're so used to wizards, dragons, and magical adventures, and it's hard to imagine the time when this was not the case. But if we rewind the clock to the 18th century, you would find out a completely different story about what kids were reading back then. Back then, kids had very few choices of what they could read. Firstly, they could choose between this, or this. It does not seem so enchanting anymore, does it? One of the books you see on the screen right now is called The Pilgrim's Progress. This book is essentially a big allegory on the Christian world, where the main protagonist, named Christian, who is burdened by a heavy load on his back symbolizing the weight of his sins, lives in a city of destruction. This story is literally a big metaphor of the journey to God, and this book was clearly written for the adult audience. In the 18th century, you were very limited in the choice of what you can read to your kids. And as surprising as it may sound, children's literature started right after the invention of childhood. As philosopher and historian Philip Arya says, in the Middle Ages, at the beginning of modern times, and for a long time after that in the lower class, children were mixed with adults as soon as they were considered capable of doing without their mothers and nannies. They immediately went straight into the great community of men, sharing in their work and play in their companions, old and young alike. This was the time when childhood simply did not exist. If you look at these pictures, you will see not children, but just nursing infants or small adults with baby faces. And this is exactly why the parents in Hansel and Gretel tale completely abandon their children, and the miller in Rumpelstiltskin sells his daughter. Before the 18th century, it was believed that kids were the most sinful creatures on earth. And why would people believe in this? Well, it was like they were stepping out of the realm of the great unknown into the world of the living. And to make sure that these little newcomers didn't catch any devilish influences along the way, they had to be baptized pronto. It was thought that the sacred ceremony would protect them from the clutches of the devil and hence protect the society from the devil in the shape of a kid. But why do you need to purify them like this? Well, it was believed that newborns carried the weight of their original sin, which is a concept and a belief that all humans inherit a state of sinfulness and moral corruption right from the first human beings, Adam and Eve. And in order to free kids from this plague, they had to be fully cleansed inside out. And this is the time when literature comes into the game. Books became the ultimate weapon in the battle against the devil's influence. The books were not meant to entertain, they were meant to teach. And during those days, honesty was the best policy. Which is why the kids back then did not read fairy tales as we used to think, but they rather read texts like Bible. And why Bible? All of the educators in the medieval time believed that you need to eliminate all of the make-believes and imaginative stories so child would not be possessed by the devil. But what happened to the fairy tales? We know that they existed, but we don't know who read them. The term fairy tale is only a convenience since few stories we call by that name contain fairies, elves, leprechauns, or similar creatures. Fairy tales can seamlessly blend into any other genre like myths, legends, romances, down-to-earth folk fables, and even cautionary tales. So what really defines a fairy tale? It is intuitive for us to know that Cinderella, Sinbad the Sailor, Hansel and Gretel are indeed fairy tales. but the stories about King Arthur or Beowulf are not. We tend to believe that fairy tales rarely have any violence in them. If you know the original story of the Sleeping Beauty, you know that the king in this story does not exactly follow the happily ever after script, and it's not as kid-friendly as it may seem. And that's where the line blurs. And really, fairy tales were not meant to be read by kids, they were meant to be read by adults. Fairy tales do have some kind of moral ending, and adults can also learn from that. The world of childhood was formed in the 18th century, and that was the time when the situation started to change. Thing is, in societies with high child mortality rates, parents often had limited expectations of their children's futures. And as child mortality rates decreased and the children's survival became more assured, there was a gradual shift towards recognizing childhood as a distinct and valuable phase of life, deserving of care, education, and opportunities to grow. By the end of 18th century, Romanticism took over the world, especially in literature. Coincidentally, that was the time when child became romanticized. Suddenly, the kids were not just little hands for chores, they were the stars of a newfound romantic era. And now, kids became something else entirely. They literally transformed into little pure-hearted angels, as you can see in the pictures. This marked the birth of a whole new genre in literature. Writers began crafting tales directly for kids, and more importantly, about kids. This had never happened before. Childhood was no longer confined to the realm of hard work and stern discipline. It became a canvas for dreams, wonder, and storytelling magic. And that was the time when the genre of fantasy emerged. But what is fantasy? It is hard to pin down this genre, but let's take a look at some of its features. The word fantasy exists in English language for as long as you can imagine, but as a literary genre, fantasy found its roots in an unexpected place, in a humble magazine known as the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Although fantasy does belong to the sci-fi branch, they are completely different things. First and foremost is the setting. In the world of fantasy, the stage is set in a place that is not far off or imaginary, it's an entirely different world. And on the flip side, science fiction thrives on a question of what if. What if cars could fly? What if we colonize Mars? Science fiction novels usually connected to the exploration of endless possibilities that science and technology might bring. But when we talk about fantasy, there is simply no need for this question. The world of fantasy always has different rules, different laws. And then there's magic. In science fiction, magic is like a well-kept secret concealed behind the curtains of a rational explanation. If you want to open a door, you just create a lockpick gadget, whereas in fantasy, you just simply say Alhamora and the door swings open. Magic is not something hidden, it is a fabric of the world of casting spells, brewing potions, and conjuring wonders with the wave of a wand. Besides that, fantasy worlds often draw inspiration from different legends and myths, more than often from European medieval time. And then, what is the difference between children fantasy and adult fantasy, or young adult fantasy? Well, it's usually more than just having a young hero in the spotlight. In the world of classic children fantasy, fantastic elements are powerful storytelling tools, a way for author to explain profound life lessons. The whole world serves as the big metaphor for a concept that author thinks is important. 19th century was the start of the fantasy era. In the very beginning of the 19th century, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published alongside with Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales and Grimm fairy tales in 1812. At that time, literature drew inspiration from folk tales, but fantasy as a genre had a long way to go. But why authors were so inspired by folk tales? Before the rise of fantasy literature, the world was already filled with stories. Folk tales and literary work like Charles Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose or Tales of Fairies were beloved by many. But there are a couple of reasons why Perrault's collection stands out. Firstly, this period was a crucial time in the history of childhood and children literature. Secondly, among the many fairy tales collections emerging in France during the late 17th century, Perrault had a distinct purpose. His stories were specifically crafted to be read to children, setting the stage for the future of the children literature. Writers of that time demanded that fantastic elements should be rare, brief, and indistinct, yet characterized by philosophical reasoning and moral truth. The world of imagination was considered to be dangerous. The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, written by Hoffmann from the 1816th, is often regarded as the first fantasy explicitly written for children. It is special because it features a young girl as the main character, it begins in a nursery, and even includes animal toys as characters. However, the story mainly revolves around the adventures of the Nutcracker, not the child. Similarly, Carlos Collodi's Adventures of Pinocchio from the 1881 has always been seen as the children's story, even though it's a bit more complex. Pinocchio, who is a puppet, is the central character. Since I mentioned Hoffmann, a German writer and composer of the late 18th century and early 19th century, he had a profound impact on the world of fantasy literature. Another great example of the fantasy story of the early 19th century is called The Golden Pot. It is titled A Fairy Tale of Our Times. What makes A Golden Pot special is how it begins. It starts in a busy city of Dresden, a place like the cities we know today. There we meet Anselmus, a student who gets caught up in a strange adventure involving magical creatures, alchemists and mysterious snake women. On the English side of the literature, one of the most prominent figures in the Victorian era was George MacDonald. His very first book, Phantastes, features a young student named Anadas whose room suddenly turns into a dreamlike fairyland forest. And when he opens a mysterious cupboard, instead of finding brooms and cleaning stuff, he discovers a secret tunnel that leads to a starry night sky. Later, Clive Lewis said that when he was writing Chronicles of Narnia, he was affected by this story. Interestingly enough, one of George MacDonald's friends, Charles Dodson, turned out to be the author of Alice in Wonderland, which he published behind the pseudonym Lewis Carroll. Published in the year of 1900, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum is a timeless classic in the world of children's literature. Since children's literature is meant to be educational, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is rich with metaphors and symbolism. Dorothy's companions she finds along the way, the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, the Cowardly Lion, represent different aspects of human nature. Those are all of the traits Dorothy lacks, but as the story portrays it, anyone can find the strengths from within. The same happened with Dorothy's silver slippers, since Dorothy always had what it takes to come back to Kansas, but all she needed is to learn how to use them effectively. This was the very start of the fantasy, and in the years forward we will meet many more great books which now became stable classic. And thank you for watching this video.